The suitcases by the front door should have been my first warning. Two matching leather bags sitting there like silent sentinels, waiting. But I was focused on the groceries in my hands, the mundane Tuesday evening routine that had defined our marriage for 8 years. David was in the kitchen when I walked in. He didn't turn around when he heard my footsteps. That should have been warning number 2. My husband always greeted me with a kiss, even on his worst days. Even during our roughest patches, he maintained that small ritual of affection. The woman sitting at our kitchen table was beautiful in the way that makes other women instantly aware of their own flaws. Auburn hair that caught the light just right. Designer clothes that fit like they were tailored specifically for her body. She held a cup of coffee in manicured hands, and when she looked up at me, her smile was practiced, confident. I set the groceries on the counter with hands that had begun to shake. The cereal box tumbled out, rolling across the granite surface David and I had picked out together 3 years ago. We'd argued about the color. I wanted something warmer. He insisted on the cold gray stone that now seemed to reflect the temperature in the room. "Sarah," David said finally, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Formal, distant, like he was addressing a business associate rather than his wife. "We need to talk." The woman at the table continued smiling. She took another sip of coffee from my favorite mug, the ridiculous one with the cartoon cat that David had bought me on our second anniversary because it made me laugh when I was sick with the flu. Seeing her lips on that rim felt like watching someone desecrate a grave. David turned around then, and I saw the man I'd fallen in love with in college had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. His eyes held no warmth, no familiar spark of connection we'd shared through nearly a decade together. He looked at me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to navigate around. "Sarah, this is Rebecca." He gestured toward the woman with a casual air of someone making ordinary introductions. "She's going to be staying with us for a while." The words hit me like physical blows. My vision blurred at the edges, and I gripped the counter to keep myself upright. This couldn't be happening. Not in our kitchen. Not with her drinking from my mug. Not with David speaking to me, like I was a stranger in my own home. "Staying with us?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. Rebecca set down the mug and stood up, smoothing her skirt with deliberate movements. She was taller than I'd first realized, probably 5'8" in her heels. Everything about her screamed sophistication and success. Her jewelry was subtle but expensive. Her handbag cost more than most people's rent. "David and I have been together for 6 months," she said, and her voice was warm honey over broken glass. Sweet on the surface, cutting underneath. "We've decided it's time to take the next step in our relationship." The room spun around me. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of David coming home to me with kisses that tasted like betrayal. Half a year of him asking about my day while building a secret life with another woman. Half a year of me being the fool who never suspected her husband was capable of such calculated deception. "The next step," I repeated, testing the words to see if they would make sense if I said them out loud. They didn't. David cleared his throat, a nervous habit I'd found endearing when we were dating. Now it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "Rebecca will be sharing our bedroom. You can take the guest room until we figure out the long-term arrangements." The long-term arrangements. He was talking about dismantling our marriage like it was a business merger gone wrong. Clinical. Efficient. Bloodless. I looked at this woman, this Rebecca, who stood in my kitchen like she owned it. Like she'd already mentally rearranged the furniture and picked out new curtains. Her confidence was absolute, unshakable. She wasn't just the other woman. She was the replacement woman, stepping into my life with the ease of someone slipping on a perfectly tailored coat. "You want me to sleep in the guest room?" I said slowly, "while she sleeps in our bed." "It's not our bed anymore, Sarah." David's voice carried a hint of impatience, like I was being deliberately difficult by not immediately accepting this new reality. "Things change. People change. It's time we all acted like adults about this situation." Adults about this situation. As if betrayal and humiliation were just part of growing up. As if 8 years of marriage could be dissolved with a casual conversation over coffee in the kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals together. Rebecca moved closer to David then, slipping her arm through his with the possessive gesture of a woman marking her territory. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen when he looked at me in years. Desire. Excitement. The kind of electric connection we'd once shared, but had somehow lost along the way. "I know this is difficult," Rebecca said, and her sympathy sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "But David and I believe honesty is the best policy. We could have continued sneaking around, but that wouldn't be fair to anyone involved." Fair to anyone involved. She was talking about my marriage like it was a business transaction where all parties needed to agree to new terms. Like my feelings were just another variable in their equation of happiness. The grocery bag crumpled in my grip. I'd been holding it so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Inside were the ingredients for David's favorite dinner. Salmon with lemon and herbs, roasted vegetables, the expensive wine he liked for special occasions. I'd planned to surprise him, to try to recapture some of the romance that had been slipping away from us lately. Instead, I was standing in my own kitchen being informed that I was no longer welcome in my own bedroom. "How long have you been planning this?" The question escaped before I could stop it. David and Rebecca exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that couples develop over time. The kind of intimate understanding David and I used to share. Seeing it pass between them felt like watching him hand over our entire history to someone else. "We've been discussing the best way to handle the transition for a few weeks," David said carefully. "We wanted to make sure we approached this thoughtfully." Thoughtfully. They'd been thoughtfully planning to destroy my life, while I thoughtfully prepared their coffee every morning and thoughtfully did David's laundry and thoughtfully maintained the life we'd built together. I set the groceries down with deliberate care, each movement precise and controlled. Inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was collapsing. Inside, I was dying a slow, agonizing death. But outside, I forced myself to remain calm, dignified. I wouldn't give this woman the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely. "I see," 2 words. That's all I could manage without my voice cracking. Rebecca smiled wider, apparently taking my composure as acceptance. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Some women in your position might react poorly." Your position. Like being betrayed and discarded was a job title. Like humiliation was a role I'd auditioned for and won. I nodded slowly, buying myself time to think. My mind was reeling, but underneath the shock and pain, something else was beginning to stir. Something cold and calculating that I didn't recognize as part of myself. A voice that whispered, I didn't have to accept this. That I didn't have to roll over and let them steamroll my life. "Well," I said finally, "I suppose I should go pack my things then." David looked relieved. Rebecca looked triumphant. Neither of them looked like they expected what came next. I walked upstairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Our bedroom looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The bed David and I had shared for 8 years, still unmade from where we'd slept the night before. His coffee cup on the nightstand, mine on the dresser. The book I'd been reading still open to page 47, a bookmark he'd given me years ago still marking my place. In 12 hours, Rebecca would be sleeping in this bed, wearing the silk nightgowns I kept in the top drawer, using the bathroom where David and I had gotten ready for work together every morning, where we'd brushed our teeth side by side like an old married couple should. I pulled out my suitcase and began packing with mechanical precision. Clothes folded neatly, toiletries organized in their travel containers. I was running on autopilot, my body going through the motions while my brain tried to process what had just happened to my life. But as I packed, I began to notice things. Small details that hadn't registered before. David's closet was already half empty. His favorite cologne was missing from the bathroom counter. The watch I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago was gone from his jewelry box. They hadn't just planned this conversation. They'd been planning this move for weeks. Maybe longer. While I'd been living in blissful ignorance, they'd been systematically erasing me from David's life, making room for her to slide seamlessly into my place. That's when I found the paperwork. Hidden in David's sock drawer, underneath the winter socks he wouldn't need until December, was a manila folder. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed, property agreements, investment portfolios, and a prenuptial agreement with Rebecca's name on it. I sat down hard on the bed, the folder spilling its contents across the comforter. David had been planning to marry Rebecca while still married to me. Not only that, he'd been protecting assets I didn't even know he had, hiding money, preparing for a divorce I didn't know was coming. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. At the bottom of the folder was a background check report on Rebecca Mason. Professional, thorough, expensive. The kind private investigators compile when someone wants to know everything about another person's life. I read it twice before the information fully sank in. Rebecca had been married 3 times before. Each marriage had ended in messy, expensive divorces where she'd walked away with substantial settlements. She had a pattern. Target successful men, seduce them, move in quickly, then orchestrate their separation from their existing wives through whatever means necessary. But the most interesting detail was buried on page 4 of the report. Rebecca Mason wasn't just a serial widow. She was currently under investigation for fraud in 2 states. Insurance fraud, to be specific. Her second husband had died in what was ruled an accidental drowning during their honeymoon. The third husband had suffered a convenient heart attack just 6 months after they'd updated his life insurance policy. The investigators hadn't been able to prove anything conclusively, but the pattern was clear enough to make her a person of interest in both cases. David didn't just have a mistress. He had a predator who specialized in wealthy, married men. And judging by the timeline on these documents, he had no idea what kind of danger he was in. I closed the folder and sat in the silence of my bedroom, processing this information. 20 minutes ago, I'd been the betrayed wife, the victim of my husband's midlife crisis. Now I was the only person who knew that David might be walking into something far worse than a conventional affair. The question was what to do with this knowledge. Downstairs, I could hear them talking in low voices, probably discussing sleeping arrangements and whose turn it was to take out the garbage in their new domestic setup. Making plans for a future that might not exist if Rebecca followed her established pattern. I could warn David. Show him the documents. Save his life and probably his fortune in the process. Or I could let Rebecca destroy him the way he'd just destroyed me. The thought surprised me with its viciousness. I'd never considered myself capable of such cold calculation. But sitting in the bedroom where another woman would be sleeping tonight, holding evidence of her probable crimes, I discovered I had depths of anger I'd never known existed. David had made his choice. He'd chosen Rebecca over me, chosen deception over honesty, chosen to humiliate me in my own home. He'd shown me exactly how much our marriage meant to him when he casually informed me I'd be sleeping in the guest room. Maybe it was time he learned the consequences of his choices. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, buried beneath the winter socks. Then I finished packing my things with a calm that surprised me. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My vision was crystal clear. When I came downstairs with my suitcase, David and Rebecca were sitting close together on the couch, his arm around her shoulders. They looked up at me with identical expressions of relief, like they'd been worried I might cause a scene after all. "I'll be staying at my sister's for now," I told them, setting my keys on the coffee table with deliberate care. "Until the long-term arrangements are finalized." David nodded, already looking past me toward whatever new life he thought he was building. "That's probably best." Rebecca squeezed his hand supportively, playing her role to perfection. The loving girlfriend, concerned about everyone's well-being. The woman who just wanted what was best for all parties involved. If I hadn't read her file, I might have almost believed her performance. "There's just one thing," I said, pausing at the front door with my hand on the handle. They both looked at me expectantly. "David, you might want to update your life insurance policy. Since you're making so many changes in your life, it seems like a good time to review your beneficiaries." Rebecca's smile flickered, just for a moment. So briefly, I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that reaction. David frowned. My insurance policy is fine, Sarah. You don't need to worry about my finances anymore. Of course not, I agreed pleasantly. I'm sure Rebecca will take excellent care of everything from now on. I walked out of my house and got into my car, leaving behind the life I'd built for 8 years. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with knowledge, with power, with the understanding that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves with their own choices. Rebecca thought she'd won. She thought she'd successfully identified and claimed her next target. She thought David was just another wealthy, naive husband who could be manipulated and ultimately disposed of when he was no longer useful. She had no idea that this time someone was watching. Someone who knew exactly what she was and what she was planning. Someone who would be very interested to see how this particular con game played out. I drove to my sister's house with the windows down, letting the cool evening air wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The suffocating weight of a dying marriage had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by something far more energizing. The thrill of the hunt. Because while Rebecca was busy setting her trap for David, I would be setting my own trap for her. And unlike my naive, trusting husband, I knew exactly what kind of predator I was dealing with. The game, as they say, was afoot. My sister Jessica opened her door before I could even knock. The expression on my face must have told her everything she needed to know. He did it, didn't he? She said, pulling me into a fierce hug. That bastard actually went through with it. I'd called Jess 3 hours ago in tears, barely able to choke out the words to explain what was happening. She'd immediately told me to pack a bag and come over, that her guest room was mine for as long as I needed it. It's worse than we thought, I said, setting my suitcase down in her hallway. Much worse. Over wine and Chinese takeout, I told her about Rebecca. About the background check David had commissioned, apparently never bothering to read the results. About the pattern of marriages and convenient deaths. About the insurance fraud investigations in 2 states. Jessica listened with growing horror, occasionally interrupting to ask questions that proved she understood the implications even better than I had initially. So let me get this straight, she said finally, pouring herself a generous second glass of wine. David has unknowingly brought a probable Black Widow into your house, and she's planning to sleep in your bed tonight. That's about the size of it. And you didn't warn him?
No.
Good. Jessica raised her glass in a mock toast. That cheating piece of garbage deserves whatever he gets. But even as she said it, I could see the concern in her eyes. Despite everything David had done to me, despite the cruel way he discarded our marriage, the idea of him potentially being murdered was sobering for both of us. I keep going back and forth, I admitted. Part of me wants to march back over there and throw that folder in his face. Save his life, even though he doesn't deserve it. And the other part thinks maybe he made this bed, and now he should lie in it. Jessica nodded slowly. What does your gut tell you? My gut tells me that Rebecca has been doing this long enough to be very good at it. And that David is exactly the kind of man who would never see it coming until it was too late. But maybe that's not my problem anymore. The words tasted bitter in my mouth, but they also tasted like freedom. For 8 years, I'd made David's problems my problems. His happiness had been more important than my own. His needs had taken precedence over mine. His comfort had been my responsibility. Maybe it was time for David to handle his own problems for once. We stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, drinking wine and talking through every possible scenario. By the time I finally went to bed in Jessica's guest room, I'd made a decision that surprised even me.
I was going to wait and see.
Not indefinitely. Not while David was in immediate physical danger. But long enough to see if Rebecca's pattern held true. Long enough to see if my cheating husband would figure out what kind of woman he'd invited into his life. If he didn't, if things started moving toward the dangerous conclusion her previous marriages had reached, then I would intervene. I might be angry, but I wasn't a monster. I wouldn't let someone be murdered, even someone who had betrayed me as completely as David had. But until that point, I was going to watch from the sidelines as Rebecca played whatever game she was playing. And if David got hurt along the way, if he lost some money or some pride or some sleep over the woman he'd chosen over his wife, well, perhaps that was just the price of education. The next morning, I woke up feeling more clear-headed than I had in months. I'd slept better in Jessica's guest room than I had in my own bed in weeks. For the first time, and I couldn't remember how long, I wasn't waking up next to someone who was lying to me. I made coffee and sat on Jessica's back porch, watching the sun rise and trying to figure out what came next in my life. I couldn't stay with my sister forever. I needed to think about lawyers, about divorce proceedings, about dividing assets, and untangling 8 years of shared finances. But first, I needed to do some research of my own. If I was going to wait and watch, I needed to be informed about what I was watching for. I needed to understand Rebecca's methods, her timeline, her patterns of behavior. I needed to become an expert on a woman I'd met for exactly 10 minutes, but who might hold the key to my husband's survival. I spent the morning at the public library, using their computers to dig deeper into Rebecca Mason's history than David's private investigator had bothered to go. What I found made my blood run cold. Rebecca wasn't just careless or unlucky. She was methodical, calculating. Each of her previous marriages had followed an almost identical pattern, right down to the timing of major financial decisions and policy changes. First, she would isolate her target from his existing support system. Friends would be gradually pushed out of the picture. Family members would be portrayed as toxic or unsupportive of the new relationship. Wives or girlfriends would be eliminated through whatever means necessary. Then came the financial consolidation. Joint bank accounts, updated insurance policies, new wills, and estate planning documents, always presented as romantic gestures, proof of commitment and trust. Finally, the tragic accidents. Always after enough time had passed for the insurance companies to process the policy changes. Always in circumstances where Rebecca had an alibi but stood to benefit substantially from her husband's death. The pattern was so consistent, it was like reading a manual for murder. And David was following the script perfectly. By the end of the day, I'd compiled a timeline of Rebecca's previous relationships and overlaid it with what I knew about her relationship with David. If her pattern held true, he had perhaps 6 months before he would be in serious physical danger. That gave me 6 months to decide whether to save the man who had destroyed my life or to let him suffer the consequences of his own choices. 6 months to watch the woman who had stolen my husband potentially plan his murder. 6 months to discover exactly what kind of person I really was beneath the dutiful wife facade I'd worn for nearly a decade. The phone call came 3 weeks later. I was at work, trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal routine, when David's number appeared on my screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering, unsure what he could possibly have to say to me at this point. Sarah, his voice sounded strained, exhausted. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Honest with you? The irony wasn't lost on me. What do you want to know, David? Did you take anything from the house when you moved out? Any papers or documents from my office? My heart began to race, but I kept my voice steady. What kind of documents? Financial statements, investment portfolios, things that wouldn't mean anything to you, but might be valuable to someone else. So Rebecca had discovered that her background check was missing. Interesting.
No, David.
I took my clothes and my personal things. That's all. Are you sure? Because someone has been going through my files, and some important papers are missing. Have you asked Rebecca? She's been living in your house for 3 weeks now. There was a long pause. Rebecca wouldn't take my financial documents. Wouldn't she? Another pause, longer this time. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, David. I'm sure you're right. I'm sure Rebecca would never do anything to betray your trust. The bitter irony in my voice must have come through clearly because David's tone sharpened. This isn't a game, Sarah. These documents contain sensitive information about investments and accounts that could be used to steal money or commit fraud. Then maybe you should call the police, I suggested sweetly. Report the burglary. I'm sure they'd be very interested in investigating who might have had access to your private papers. Stop it. David's voice was tight with frustration. I know you're angry about how things ended between us, but this is serious. I'm not angry, David. I'm impressed. Impressed? By how quickly your new girlfriend is settling into your life. 3 weeks, and already she's going through your private papers. That's what I call taking initiative. Rebecca isn't going through my papers. Then who is? He was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its certainty. I don't know. Well, I hope you figured out, I said, then hung up before he could respond. I sat at my desk, staring at my phone and processing what I'd just learned. Rebecca was moving faster than her previous pattern suggested she would. Something had accelerated her timeline, made her more aggressive about accessing David's financial information. The question was whether this was a deviation from her normal method, or whether she'd simply gotten better at hiding her activities with her first 2 husbands. Either way, it suggested that David's 6-month window might be optimistic. That evening, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I drove past my old house. It looked exactly the same from the outside. Same white shutters, same flower beds I'd planted and maintained for years. Same mailbox with our last name painted in cheerful blue letters. But there were subtle changes that spoke to new occupancy. The porch light was on, even though it was barely dark. Rebecca's car was parked in the spot where I used to park, like she'd already claimed that space as her own. The kitchen window glowed with warm light, and I could see 2 figures moving around inside. They were cooking dinner together, playing house in the home David and I had built together. I sat in my car across the street, watching the domestic scene unfold behind windows I'd chosen and curtains I'd hung. It should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like I was watching a play where actors were performing roles I'd once inhabited. Rebecca appeared in the kitchen window, laughing at something David had said. She looked radiant, perfectly at home in my former life. It was an impressive performance, and I found myself wondering if she'd been practicing in the mirror again. David handed her a glass of wine, the same brand we'd always kept for special occasions. The same wine that was probably still sitting in the cellar, aging while they drank it to celebrate their new life together. I was about to drive away when I saw something that made me freeze. Rebecca was holding David's phone, scrolling through something on the screen while he had his back turned to finish cooking. Her expression was focused, concentrated, like she was memorizing whatever she was reading. When David turned around, she quickly handed the phone back to him with a smile, seamlessly transitioning from surveillance to affection. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual about the exchange. But I had noticed, and I understood exactly what I'd witnessed. Rebecca was gathering information. Phone numbers, contact lists, email accounts, financial apps. Every piece of David's digital life that might be useful for her ultimate plan. She was also moving much faster than I'd anticipated. I drove home to Jessica's house with a decision crystallizing in my mind. Rebecca wasn't following her previous timeline. She was accelerating, which meant David was in more immediate danger than my research had suggested. Which meant it was time for me to accelerate my own timeline. The next morning I called in sick to work and made a different kind of phone call instead. To a private investigator of my own. Marcus Chen had been recommended by my divorce lawyer as someone who specialized in financial fraud and marital misconduct. He was expensive, thorough, and, according to his reputation, completely ruthless when it came to exposing the truth. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, far from anywhere David or Rebecca might accidentally encounter us. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that showed in everything from his perfectly organized briefcase to the way he listened without interrupting. I told him everything. About David's affair, about Rebecca's background, about the missing documents, and the accelerated timeline I'd observed. I gave him copies of everything I'd found in David's sock drawer, along with my own research into Rebecca's previous marriages. Marcus reviewed the materials with professional calm, occasionally making notes in precise handwriting. When I finished talking, he was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents I'd provided. "This is very thorough work," he said finally. "Better than most private investigators would have done, frankly. You missed your calling. Can you help me?" "The question is what kind of help you want." Marcus looked up from the papers, his expression serious. "Are you trying to save your husband from a potentially dangerous woman? Or are you trying to gather evidence to use against both of them in divorce proceedings?" "I'm trying to make sure no one gets murdered," I said. "Everything else is secondary to that." Marcus nodded slowly. "Fair enough. What's your timeline?" "I think Rebecca is moving faster than her previous pattern suggests she will. Based on what I've observed, I'd say David has maybe 2 months before he's in real physical danger, not 6-inch. Then we need to move fast." Marcus closed his briefcase with decisive efficiency. "I'll need access to Rebecca's current activities. Phone records, financial transactions, her daily routine."
Can you get me any of that?
"David changed all the locks when I moved out. I don't have access to the house anymore." "That's not a problem. There are other ways to gather information." Marcus handed me his card. "I'll start with basic surveillance and work from there. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Stay in contact with your husband. Not frequently, just enough to maintain the appearance of normal post-separation communication. If Rebecca is following her established pattern, she'll want to know what you're doing and whether you pose any threat to her plans." "You want me to let her spy on me?" "I want you to control what she sees when she does. Give her enough information to make her feel secure, but not enough to make her suspicious. We need her to stick to her timeline long enough for us to gather evidence against her." It made sense in a cold, strategic way. Keep Rebecca feeling confident and in control while we build a case that would expose her for what she was. "How long do you think it will take?" "If she's as methodical as her history suggests, she'll leave a trail we can follow. Give me 4 weeks to build a comprehensive case. By then, we'll have enough evidence to take to the police or to scare her away from your husband permanently." 4 weeks. It seemed both like an eternity and no time at all. Marcus must have seen my hesitation because his expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Patterson, I've seen cases like this before. Women like Rebecca count on their victims being isolated and uninformed. Your husband has no idea what kind of danger he's in, but you do. That gives us an advantage she won't see coming." I shook his hand and agreed to his plan, then drove home feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line. I was no longer just the wronged wife waiting to see what happened. I was actively working to expose Rebecca, which meant I was actively working to save David's life. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had betrayed me, humiliated me, and discarded me was now depending on my protection, even though he didn't know it. The man who had chosen another woman over me was about to discover that I was the only person standing between him and a potentially lethal mistake. Part of me wondered if I was doing the right thing. Part of me thought maybe David deserved to face the consequences of his choices without my intervention. But the larger part of me knew I couldn't live with myself if I let someone be murdered, even someone who had broken my heart. So I would save him. Not because he deserved it, but because saving him was the right thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, because seeing Rebecca's face when her carefully planned con fell apart would be worth every penny I was paying Marcus Chen. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Marcus was as good as his reputation suggested, and Rebecca was apparently as careless as her success had made her overconfident. Within a week, Marcus had documentation of Rebecca accessing David's email accounts, his banking apps, and his investment portfolios. She was systematically cataloging his assets and debts, building a comprehensive financial profile that went far beyond what a loving girlfriend would need to know. More disturbing, she had already contacted David's insurance company twice. Once to inquire about policy details, and once to ask about the process for updating beneficiaries. "She's moving much faster than her previous timeline," Marcus reported during our second meeting. "Either she's gotten more efficient, or something has spooked her into accelerating her plan." That something was probably me, I realized. My phone call with David about the missing documents had tipped Rebecca off that someone was watching her activities. She decided to move quickly rather than risk exposure. How much time do we have? Based on her current pace, I'd say 6 weeks, maybe 8. She's already started the process of isolating David from his support system. She's convinced him to stop seeing his Thursday night poker group. She's manufactured arguments with his brother and sister-in-law. She's systematically removing everyone who might notice if David started behaving strangely or seemed to be in distress. The efficiency was chilling. In less than a month, Rebecca had managed to cut David off from most of his close relationships. Soon, the only person who would have regular contact with him would be Rebecca herself. What about physical evidence? Anything that would convince the police she's planning to hurt him? Marcus shook his head. She's too smart for that. Everything she's doing could be explained as normal relationship behavior if you didn't know her history. That's what makes her so dangerous. So, what do? We spring our own trap. Marcus outlined his plan with the same methodical precision Rebecca used in planning her cons. We would feed Rebecca false information through carefully staged conversations, making her believe David had even more assets than she discovered. We would document her reactions and her follow-up actions, building a pattern of behavior that clearly showed predatory intent. Most importantly, we would create a situation where Rebecca would have to reveal her true intentions before she could act on them. It's risky, Marcus warned me. If she realizes what we're doing, she might panic and hurt David sooner rather than later. And if we don't do anything, then your husband will probably be dead within 2 months. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. What do you need me to do? The plan began the following Monday with a phone call to David. I'd rehearsed the conversation with Marcus, practicing until it sounded natural and spontaneous. I needed to plant specific information while making it seem like an accidental disclosure. David, I said when he answered, I need to ask you about the divorce proceedings. What about them? His voice was cautious, professional. My lawyer says we need to declare all assets, including any inheritance or family money. I told him about your grandmother's trust fund, but he says there might be other accounts I'm not aware of. There was a pause. David's grandmother had died 5 years ago and left him exactly nothing. But Rebecca wouldn't know that. I'm not sure what you mean. The offshore investment account. The one your father set up when you graduated law school. My attorney says it could affect the settlement if we don't disclose it properly. David's father had never set up any offshore accounts, but again, Rebecca had no way of knowing that. Sarah, I don't think we should discuss financial matters over the phone. You're right. I just wanted to make sure I gave my lawyer accurate information. I'll have him contact your attorney directly. I hung up before David could ask any more questions, then sat back and waited to see what would happen next. According to Marcus, who was monitoring Rebecca's communications, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of my phone call, Rebecca had contacted 3 different offshore banking institutions, apparently trying to verify the existence of accounts that didn't exist. She'd also called 2 estate planning attorneys, inquiring about the process for updating international investment portfolios. She took the bait completely, Marcus reported. She's now operating under the assumption that David has substantially more money than she originally thought. Will that make her more or less dangerous? More dangerous in the short term, but more careless in the long term. Greed makes people stupid. Over the next 2 weeks, we fed Rebecca increasingly elaborate false information about David's supposed hidden assets. Fictional property investments in Costa Rica. Imaginary cryptocurrency portfolios. A non-existent partnership in a European tech startup. Each piece of misinformation was delivered through seemingly innocent channels. A casual comment I made to Jessica, knowing Rebecca was monitoring David's phone and might overhear our conversations. A fake document I left visible in my car when I met David to sign divorce papers, positioned where Rebecca could photograph it through the window. With each new piece of information, Rebecca's behavior became more erratic and more obvious. She was spending hours each day researching investment opportunities and international banking laws. She was pushing David to make dramatic changes to his estate planning. She was asking increasingly specific questions about his family's financial history. Most tellingly, She had already scheduled appointments with 3 different life insurance companies. She's planning to increase his coverage substantially, Marcus explained. Probably by a factor of 10, which is consistent with her previous marriages. How much time do we have left? Not much. She's moving into the final phase faster than I anticipated. I think she wants to close this deal quickly because she's worried about exposure. What Marcus didn't say, but what we both understood, was that the final phase of Rebecca's con involved David's death. It's time to call the police. Marcus shook his head. We don't have enough hard evidence yet. Everything we've documented could still be explained away as circumstantial. We need her to make one more move, something that clearly shows criminal intent. And if that move is murdering my husband, then we make sure she doesn't get the chance. The trap we set was elegant in its simplicity. I called David one final time, ostensibly to discuss the division of our shared assets. During the conversation, I casually mentioned that I would be out of town for the weekend, visiting my college roommate in Seattle. A girls' weekend, I said. A chance to get away and clear my head. What I didn't mention was that Marcus and I would actually be spending the weekend conducting surveillance on my old house, watching Rebecca's activities when she thought no one was paying attention. We set up in a rental car across the street, equipped with cameras and recording equipment, prepared to document whatever Rebecca did when she believed she had complete privacy. We didn't have to wait long. Friday evening, Rebecca left the house carrying a small duffel bag and drove to a storage unit facility across town. Marcus followed at a distance while I maintained watch on the house. 20 minutes later, he called me with news that made my blood run cold. She has a storage unit filled with equipment, he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Medical equipment. Syringes for bags, pharmaceutical supplies, and bottles of what looked like prescription medications. Prescription medications for what? Heart medication, blood thinners, insulin. The kinds of drugs that could cause a fatal reaction if administered to someone who doesn't need them. Rebecca was planning to kill David by making it look like a medical emergency. A heart attack or diabetic coma that would appear completely natural to anyone who wasn't looking for signs of foul play. We need to call the police now. Already done. They're on their way to both locations. I stayed on the line with Marcus as police units converged on the storage facility and our house simultaneously. Through our surveillance equipment, I could see David in the kitchen, completely unaware that his life was being saved by law enforcement officers he didn't even know were there. Rebecca was arrested at the storage facility, caught in possession of enough controlled substances to kill a dozen people. The evidence in her storage unit included detailed plans for David's murder, complete with timelines and contingency scenarios. She had been exactly 2 weeks away from killing him. David called me 3 hours later, his voice hollow with shock. The police want to talk to you, he said. They say you're the one who exposed Rebecca. They say you saved my life. Yes.
Why?
The question came out as barely a whisper. After what I did to you, after how I treated you, why would you save my life? I thought about lying, about giving him some noble answer about doing the right thing, or being unable to live with myself if I'd let him be murdered. Instead, I told him the truth. Because despite everything you did to me, I'm not the kind of person who lets someone be killed out of spite. Even someone who broke my heart. There was a long silence. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly, impossibly sorry. I know you are. Can we? Is there any chance we could try to work things out? Start over? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 8 years of marriage and 37 days of betrayal.
No, David.
There isn't. I understand, his voice cracked slightly. But thank you for saving my life, for being a better person than I deserved. After I hung up, I sat in Jessica's guest room and tried to process what I was feeling. Relief that the nightmare was over. Satisfaction that Rebecca would face justice for her crimes. Sadness that my marriage was truly finished. But underneath all of that was something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Pride in myself for being strong enough to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. Rebecca was eventually convicted of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and the deaths of her previous 2 husbands. She would spend the rest of her life in prison. David and I divorced quietly 6 months later. He offered me half of everything, including assets I'd never known existed. I took only what I needed to start over. I never told him about the background check he'd commissioned but never read. Some lessons I figured people need to learn for themselves. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd let Rebecca succeed in her plan. If I'd chosen revenge over righteousness, if I'd let my broken heart make the decision instead of my conscience. I'm grateful I'll never have to find out the answer to that question. Some victories aren't about getting what you want. Sometimes they're about becoming who you're meant to be. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply being the better person.